Imagine a city where the flicker of a single flame could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. A city where the gods were believed to walk among mortals, their will enforced by rituals so sacred that a single misstep could bring divine wrath upon an entire civilization. This was Rome, a place where power was absolute, where devotion was demanded, and where the lives of a few young women were bound to a fire that could never go out. These women were the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, whose sacred duty was to keep Rome's eternal flame burning. But beneath the honor, beneath the reverence, lay a truth far darker, story of control, sacrifice, and unimaginable cruelty. Today, we peel back the layers of myth to uncover the gruesome fate of these women, whose lives were both exalted and enslaved, whose devotion was rewarded with fear, and whose smallest failures could lead to a death so horrific it defies comprehension. Let's step back to the heart of ancient Rome, to a time when the Republic was still young, its streets alive with the clamor of merchants, the chants of priests, and the weight of a society obsessed with divine favor. The Vestal Virgins were no ordinary women, chosen as children, often between the ages of 6 and 10. They were plucked from Rome's elite families' patricians, whose wealth and status made their daughters desirable offerings to the state. Picture a young girl, barely old enough to understand the world, standing before a crowd in the forum. Her hair is braided, her eyes wide with awe and fear, as the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest priest, declares her a Vestal. She is no longer a daughter, no longer a sister, she is now a living symbol of Rome's purity, her life dedicated to Vestka, her body and soul surrendered to a role that will define her every breath for the next 30 years or longer. If fate is unkind, what did it mean to be a Vestal Virgin? To the Romans, these women were sacred, almost divine themselves. They tended the eternal flame in the Temple of Vesta, a small, circular sanctuary in the Forum where a fire burned as the heartbeat of the city. If that flame went out, it was believed the gods would abandon Rome, leaving it vulnerable to famine, plague, or conquest. The Vestals' vigilance was Rome's shield, their purity, its guarantee. They were revered, granted privileges no other women in Rome could dream of. They could own property, manage their own wealth, and even influence legal proceedings, rights that set them apart in a society where women were typically under the thumb of fathers or husbands. They rode in special carriages, were honored at public games, and their presence was sought at the most sacred ceremonies. To the outside world, they were untouchable, their white woolen robes and veiled heads a mark of divine favor. But let's pause here and ask, what does it mean to be untouchable? Does it mean freedom, or does it mean isolation? For the Vestals, it was both and neither. Their privileges came at a cost so steep it's hard to fathom. From the moment they were chosen, they were no longer their own. Their lives were governed by rules so rigid, so invasive, that every moment was a test of obedience. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to bear children, forbidden even to think of love. Their chastity was not just a personal vow, it was a public contract, a promise to Rome itself. To break it was not just a sin, it was treason, and the punishment, a fate so brutal it would haunt the dreams of anyone who heard of it. Let's walk through the life of a Vestal, step by step, to understand the weight of this role. Imagine you're one of these girls, chosen at 7 years old. You're taken from your family, your toys, your bed, and brought to the house of the Vestals, a secluded complex next to the Temple of Vesta. It's a grand place, with marble columns and lush gardens, but it feels like a cage. You're taught to tend the sacred fire, to grind grain for ritual cakes, to perform ceremonies with precision, so exact that a single mistake could be seen as an omen of disaster. Your days are filled with prayers, offerings, and the constant scrutiny of the other Vestals, older women whose eyes seem to see through you. You're told your purity is Rome's strength, that your body is a vessel for the goddess. But you're also told, in whispers, what happens if you fail. The vow of chastity was the cornerstone of a Vestal's life, but it wasn't just about abstaining from physical relationships. It was about total devotion, a life stripped of personal desire. The Vestals lived under a microscope, their every action watched by priests, magistrates, and even the public. A glance held too long, a laugh too carefree, could spark rumors, and rumors, in Rome, were deadly. The Pontifex Maximus, the man who oversaw the Vestals, held absolute power over their lives. He could interpret any sin a faltering flame, a misspoken prayers, evidence of impurity. And when impurity was suspected, the consequences were swift and merciless. Let's talk about that punishment, because it's here that the true horror of the Vestal's fate comes into focus. If a Vestal was found guilty of breaking her vow of chastity, she faced a death sentence unlike any other in Rome. She would be buried alive, not in a quiet grave, not in a moment of mercy, but in a ritual so calculated, so steeped in symbolism, that it was meant to terrify and control. The Romans believed that a Vestal's impurity angered the gods, and her death had to appease them, without shedding her sacred blood, so they devised a punishment that was both cruel and cunning. Entombment in an underground chamber, a place called the Campus Celeratus, the field of crime. Picture the scene. A young woman, perhaps in her 20s, is accused of unchastity. Maybe she was guilty, maybe she was framed. History tells us both happened. The trial is swift, presided over by the Pontifex Maximus and a council of priests. The evidence is often flimsy, a rumor, a jealous rival's word, or the simple fact that the sacred flame went out on her watch. She's stripped of her white robes, her sacred veil torn away. The city, once her protector, turns against her. Crowds gather, not to mourn, but to witness. She's led through the streets, her hands bound, her face pale with terror. The people watch in silence, some with pity, others with righteous anger, believing her sin has endangered them all. At the edge of the city, a small underground chamber has been prepared. It's barely a room, just a hollowed-out space with a cot, a lamp, and a meager supply of food and water. The Vestal is forced down a ladder into this tomb. She knows what's coming, but the reality is too horrific to fully grasp. The ladder is pulled up, the entrance sealed with earth and stone. Above, the priests perform rituals to absolve Rome of her sin, while below, in the suffocating dark, she is left to die. The food might last a day or two, the lamp a few hours, but the air will run out, or her will to live will break first. She scratches at the walls, she screams, she prays, but no one comes. The city moves on, the flame is rekindled, and her name is erased from memory. This wasn't a rare occurrence. Historical records, though sparse, tell us of at least 20 Vestals who faced this fate over the centuries. Some were accused during times of crisis wars, plagues, or political upheaval when Rome needed a scapegoat. Others were victims of power struggles, their deaths convenient for ambitious men. Take the case of Cornelia, a Vestal in the 1st century BCE. She was accused of unchastity during the dictatorship of Sulla, a time when political enemies were routinely eliminated. Historians like Plutarch suggest her trial was a sham, a way to remove a woman whose influence or connections threatened the wrong people. She was buried alive, her protests ignored, her tomb sealed, while Rome's elite looked the other way. But let's not just focus on the punishment. Let's ask, what kind of society creates such a system? What does it say about Rome that it could revere these women as near goddesses yet destroy them with such cold precision? The Vestals were a paradox, both powerful and powerless, sacred yet disposable. Their role was born from a deep fear of divine retribution, a belief that the gods demanded perfection. But it was also a tool of control, a way to enforce order in a society obsessed with hierarchy. The Vestal's chastity wasn't just about purity, it was about submission, a reminder that even the most exalted could be crushed under the weight of tradition. Think about the psychological toll on these women. From childhood, they were taught to fear failure, to see their bodies as public property. They lived in a constant state of vigilance, knowing a single accusation could end their lives. How do you carry that weight? How do you wake each morning knowing your every move is watched, your every word judged? The house of the Vestals, for all its luxury, must have felt like a prison, its walls echoing with the unspoken dread of what could happen if the flame went out, if a rumor took hold, if the gods or the men who spoke for them turned against you. And what about the men who enforced this system? The Pontifex Maximus, the senators, the priests. They held the power to accuse, to judge, to condemn. Their authority was absolute, their decisions final. Yet they, too, were bound by the same fears that drove Rome's obsession with the Vestals. A city that believed its survival depended on a flame was a city always on edge, always looking for someone to blame when things went wrong. The Vestals were convenient targets, their lives, a currency to be spent when the gods needed appeasing or the public needed distracting. Let's linger on that idea for a moment. The Vestals as currency. Their lives were not their own. But neither were they truly Rome's. They belonged to a system. A machine of ritual and power that chewed up individuality and spit out obedience. The same society that built aqueducts and conquered empires couldn't imagine a world where women could be trusted to live freely, where purity didn't require sacrifice. The Vestal's fate wasn't just a tragedy of individuals. It was a symptom of a culture that saw control as the only path to stability. As we move deeper into this story, consider the ripple effects of this system. The Vestals weren't just priestesses. They were symbols, their lives a mirror held up to Rome's values. When a Vestal was buried alive, it wasn't just her life that was extinguished, it was a piece of Rome's soul, a reminder of the cost of absolute power. The crowds that watched her final walk, the priests who sealed her tomb, the citizens who whispered her name in fear, they were all complicit, all part of a machine that demanded sacrifice to keep turning. Now, let's turn to a specific moment in history, a case that reveals the full brutality of this system. In 114 BCE, a Vestal named Marcia was accused of unchastity alongside two others, Aemilia and Licinia. The accusations came during a time of unrest, when Rome was reeling from military defeats and economic strain. The sacred flame had reportedly gone out, a sign the gods were angry. The Pontifex Maximus, backed by the Senate, pointed to the Vestals as the cause. What followed was a trial that shocked even the Romans, not for its outcome, but for its scale. All three women were condemned, but Marcia's case stands out. Ancient sources, like the historian Livy, suggest she was innocent, her only crime being her association with the other two. Yet she was buried alive, her tomb sealed while her family's pleas echoed in the forum. Why Marcia? Why these women? At this moment, the answer lies in the politics of fear. Rome was a city that thrived on spectacle, and the execution of a Vestal was the ultimate show. It rallied the people, distracted them from their troubles, and reinforced the power of the state. But it also sowed seeds of doubt. If even the Vestals, Rome's most sacred daughters, could be sacrificed so easily, who was safe? The answer, of course, was no. Not when power was absolute, not when fear ruled the day. As we stand here, looking back at these women's lives, it's tempting to see them as distant, their stories as relics of a barbaric past. But let's not be so quick to dismiss them. The Vestal's fate forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own world. What happens when power goes unchecked? When fear overrides compassion? When individuals are reduced to symbols, their humanity stripped away for the sake of a greater cause? These are not just questions about Rome, they're questions about us, about the systems we build and the sacrifices we demand. The Vestals were not just victims, they were warnings. Their lives, their deaths, tell us what happens when devotion becomes control, when purity becomes a weapon. They remind us that power, left unchecked, will always find someone to crush. And as we trace their steps through the forum, as we imagine their final moments in the dark, we're left with a choice: to look away, or to face the truth of what humanity is capable of then. And now, as we stand in the shadow of the Vestal story, let's linger on the airless darkness of that underground chamber, the final resting place of a woman whose only crime might have been a whisper, a glance, or simply being in the wrong place, at the wrong time. The weight of the earth above, the fading flicker of the lamp, the silence that swallowed her screams, these are not just details of a distant past. They are a mirror, reflecting the cost of a society that demands absolute obedience, that wields power without mercy. The Vestal Virgins were Rome's sacred daughters, but they were also its prisoners, their lives a tightrope stretched over an abyss of fear and control. Let's walk further into their world, tracing the threads of their suffering, the men who pulled the strings, and the lessons that echo across centuries. Consider the daily reality of a Vestal's life, the unrelenting pressure that shaped her every moment. You're a young woman now, perhaps 15, a decade into your service. The novelty of your role has long faded, replaced by a bone-deep awareness of what's at stake. You wake before dawn to tend the sacred fire, your hands trembling as you arrange the kindling. A single spark failing to catch could be seen as a sign of divine displeasure, and you've heard the stories blamed for famines or defeats because the flame faltered. You move through the house of the Vestals with precision, your white stole pristine, your hair bound in the complex knots that mark your status. Every gesture is watched, not just by the other Vestals but by the slaves, the priests, even the visitors who come to gawk at the goddesses chosen. You've learned to keep your eyes down, your voice soft, because attention is dangerous. A laugh too loud, a moment of frustration, could be twisted into evidence of impurity. The house of the Vestals was no sanctuary. It was a stage, and you were always performing. The other Vestals, your supposed sisters, were both allies and threats. Jealousy, rivalry, or simple exhaustion could turn one against another. Historical accounts, like those from Suetonius, hint at tensions within the order, accusations whispered to the Pontifex Maximus, betrayals born of fear or ambition. You couldn't trust anyone fully, not when a single word could lead to your downfall. And yet, you were bound to these women, living together, praying together, sharing the weight of a role that isolated you from the world. You couldn't visit your family freely, couldn't walk the streets without an escort, couldn't dream of a life beyond the temple's walls. Your world was the fire, the rituals, the endless cycle of duty. But let's not just see the Vestals as passive victims. They were women of agency, too, navigating a system designed to constrain them. Some wielded their influence with skill, using their status to protect family interests or sway legal disputes. Others found quiet ways to resist, perhaps in the way they taught the younger Vestals, passing down not just rituals, but warnings. Yet even their power was a double-edged sword. The more influence a Vestal gained, the more she became a target. A powerful Vestal could be seen as a threat, her independence a challenge to the men who controlled Rome's religious and political spheres. The same society that elevated them was quick to tear them down, and the line between reverence and resentment was razor. Now, let's turn to the men who held the reins, the Pontifex Maximus and the priestly colleges who judged the Vestals. These were not just religious figures, they were politicians, their authority intertwined with Rome's power structure. The Pontifex Maximus, elected for life, was a figure of immense influence, overseeing not just the Vestals, but all of Rome's religious life. Men like Julius Caesar, who held the title in the 1st century BCE, used it to bolster their political careers, their decisions shaped as much by ambition as by piety. When a Vestal was accused, the trial was less about justice than about optics. A guilty verdict could rally public support, deflect blame from a failing leader, or eliminate a rival's ally. The Vestals were pawns in a larger game, their lives expendable when the stakes were high. Take the case of Tucha, a Vestal in the 3rd century BCE, whose story reveals the absurdity and cruelty of this system. Accused of unchastity, she faced certain death until, according to legend, she performed a miracle, carrying water in a sieve from the Tiber River to the Forum without spilling a drop, proving her purity. The story, recorded by Valerius Maximus, was celebrated as divine intervention, but let's look closer. Why was she accused in the first place? The sources are vague, mentioning only rumors. Was it a rival's slander? A political maneuver? And what about the Vestals who couldn't summon a miracle? Tucha's story, whether true or embellished, underscores the arbitrariness of the accusations. Innocence was irrelevant when guilt served a purpose. This brings us to a darker truth. The accusations against Vestals were often less about chastity than about control. Rome's obsession with purity was a facade, a way to enforce order in a chaotic world. The Vestals' chastity symbolized Rome's moral strength, but it also gave the elite a tool to manipulate public fear. When crops failed, when armies lost, when the Tiber flooded, the people looked for answers. Blaming a Vestal was easier than questioning the gods or the leaders who claimed to speak for them. The ritual of burying a Vestal alive was a spectacle of scapegoating, a way to restore confidence by sacrificing a symbol, and it worked. The crowds, gripped by fear and faith, accepted the punishment as necessary, their doubts buried with the accused. But let's ask, what did this do to Rome's soul? Every time a Vestal was entombed, a piece of the city's humanity was buried too. The act was meant to purify, but it corrupted, exposing the fragility of a society that relied on fear to hold itself together. The Vestals' deaths were not just personal tragedies, they were public rituals that normalized cruelty. The same crowds that cheered at gladiatorial games watched a Vestal's final walk with the same mix of awe and detachment. The same priests who prayed for Rome's salvation sealed a woman's tomb without hesitation. This was a culture that thrived on spectacle, but it paid a price: desensitization, division, and a creeping acceptance of power's excesses. Now, let's step into the mind of a Vestal facing accusation. You're 22, a senior Vestal, respected but not yet free of your 30-year vow. The flame went out last night, a mistake you can't explain. You relit it quickly, but the damage is done. Whispers spread, and soon the Pontifex Maximus summons you. The trial is a blur: accusations of unchastity, witnesses you've never met, evidence that feels like a trap. You protest, you weep, but the verdict is inevitable. As you lead through the Forum, the faces in the crowd blur together. Some pity you, others curse you, most just stare. You want to scream your innocence, but your voice is lost in the ritual's momentum. The ladder descends into the chamber, and you climb down, each step a betrayal of the life you've lived. The earth closes above you, and in the dark, you're left with nothing but your thoughts: anger, fear, and a desperate hope that the gods, at least, know the truth. This moment, this descent, is where the Vestal story becomes universal. It's not just about Rome, not just about priestesses or flames. It's about the human cost of systems that prioritize control over compassion. The Vestals were caught in a web of power, faith, and fear, their lives a cautionary tale about what happens when authority is absolute. Their deaths were not accidents. They were designed, choreographed, to reinforce a hierarchy that placed men above women, state above individual, fear above truth. Let's reflect on the legacy of the Vestals, because their story doesn't end with their tombs. They served Rome for over 1,000 years, from the monarchy to the empire, their role evolving but never fading. Even as Christianity rose, the Vestals persisted, their flame burning until 394 CE, when the Emperor Theodosius banned pagan worship. The last Vestals faded into obscurity, their temple abandoned, their house reclaimed by the earth. But their story lingers, carved into Rome's stones, whispered in the texts of historians like Livy, Plutarch, and Tacitus. They remind us that power, no matter how sacred its guise, is a dangerous thing when it demands sacrifice without question. What can we take from this? The Vestal's fate challenges us to look at our own world, to question the systems we accept, the sacrifices we deem necessary. When we see individuals reduced to symbols, whether for faith, ideology, or politics, we must pause. When we hear calls for purity, for absolute loyalty, we must ask, at what cost? The Vestals were not just women. They were warnings, their lives a testament to the fragility of freedom in the face of unchecked power. As we close this journey, imagine standing in the Roman Forum today, where the Temple of Vesta's ruins still stand. The columns are broken, the flame long extinguished, but the air holds a weight, a memory of the women who lived and died here. They were Rome's heart, its conscience, its victims. Their story is a call to empathy, a plea to remember that behind every symbol is a human being, behind every ritual, a life. The Vestal's gruesome fate is not just history, it's a mirror. asking us to look at ourselves, to see the flames we tend, the powers we serve, and the truths we bury in the dark.